Okay, looking forward to this today. It is the second part of my response to S J Thomason and her 8 questions that she believes atheists cannot plausibly answer. So we're moving through to the second half of those questions. This is part 2. Phase 2. Phase 2, I should call it. It sounds a little bit more impressive. If you haven't seen the first part, the first phase, in fact, I'll leave you a link in the footnotes, so I will. Slipping into a little bit of Irish. A little bit of Irish there, to be sure. I don't know where that came from, really. The same thing applies, I would say, as with the first part, which is that plausibility is a relative thing. A plausible answer depends upon the plausibility of the other answers. I cannot give you necessarily definitive copper-bottomed answers to every single thing, but you've got to evaluate those answers over the answers that it's competing against, including the answers that an S J Thomason, that a Christian, would give. So that is what I will be asking you to consider, to set the answers that I could give alongside the answers that an S J Thomason could give in terms of plausibility. So with that in mind, let us move on to the first of these 4 questions. This is question 5 on the list. How can atheists explain the ordering of our DNA? If a reasonable person wrote "I love you" written in the sand at the beach, he would assume that someone wrote the words intentionally. Similarly, our human genome has been mapped out, and we know that our DNA consists of 3.5 billion perfectly ordered letters. You may argue that we are highly complex and evolved, yet even the DNA of the simplest of organisms, the amoeba, contains thousands of volumes of information. The latter is noted by Richard Dawkins, a prominent atheist and zoologist. Oh, this is a really interesting one, but it's been one that's been done to death. Folks, I went through, and that's what's frustrating. There is so much that you can say here. I can only say a fraction of it. I went through a period where I must have read a dozen books on evolutionary biology from 8 or 9 different authors. And what was fascinating is that almost every one of those authors at some point would tackle creationist or intelligent design arguments and compare it to an evolutionary perspective to describe what we see in terms of the genome, in terms of genotype and phenotype. And they'd all come up with different examples, different arguments, and they'd all be equally wonderful. There is a dazzling constellation of wonderful arguments that you can present here, that you can go out and read about, that S J Thomason can go out and read about, and I can't do that justice. What I will do is just say, you'll find the footage online. This was filmed for a Channel 4, I think, in the UK TV programme, of Richard Dawkins mentioned there, involved in the dissection of a giraffe. There is a nerve, the recurrent laryngeal nerve, which obviously runs from the larynx to the brain, and it doesn't just go on a straight path, because in the development, if you look at this same nerve in simpler organisms, it follows a nice straight path, but it hooks round a blood vessel. And that blood vessel wants to stay in the chest, but this nerve wants to stay in the head, but it hooks round it. To such an extent that in a giraffe, it runs all the way down from the larynx, all the way down the neck round this blood vessel, and then all the way back up to the brain again.
It controls the muscles that then control making sounds, but also coordinating breathing and swallowing in this area. So this is a very important nerve. Interestingly, where it ends is pretty close to where it started. It started here, coming out of the brain. It really only needed to go about 2 inches.
Yes, amazing.
But it went all the way down and came all the way back.
Yes. That's a beautiful example of historical legacy as opposed to design.
Are you telling me plausibly that looks designed? A drunken designer would not design it that way. Evolution provides the perfect, very, very simple, plausible explanation for why that would be as it is. I don't see how a designer provides that explanation. She also talks about the simplest organisms being amoeba, and yet they're still really, really complicated, as if that's some kind of mystery, and this is one we hear a lot, of course. Surely there should be these really, really simple organisms. Of course, that is a fallacy. You may as well suggest that God or aliens just gave us modern mobile phones as they are now, because if they hadn't, if you walked into a shop that sells mobile phones, cell phones, that you would see the simplest models, the earliest models there as well. We understand why we don't see them. Because effectively there is the same evolutionary process and evolutionary pressures taking place on these phones. We provide, the consumer provides the selection pressure, and the shops don't sell those earliest models because they have been out-competed. They're not good enough to have a niche anymore in the marketplace, because even the simplest phones that those shops sell are orders of magnitude better, more complex, and yet simpler to produce than the earliest mobile phones. So you just don't see them anymore. The only place you will see them will be in a museum or perhaps in somebody's attic. So it's absolutely easy to explain. She then talked about 3.5 billion perfectly ordered genes, perfectly ordered letters, and that's not the case. As far as I'm aware, there was one project a few years ago called something like the Evolve Project, which seemed to suggest that maybe 80% of our genome has some kind of a function, but really that's been widely discredited, and it goes against the grain of every single thing on this. And generally what is suggested is that it's about sort of 10%, 15%, something along those lines of our genome that actually does something. The rest of it is effectively genetic rubble that has got involved in there. It is broken genes, pseudogenes, genetic material that has been duplicated but doesn't fulfill a function. It is retroviruses, viruses that have managed to ingratiate themselves, to insert themselves within our genome and so replicate rather than overtaking the organism by just allowing the organism to do its thing. If you think all that genetic material has a function, then let me remind you of the onion test. Ryan Gregory, 2007. The onion test is a simple reality check for anyone who thinks they have come up with a universal function for junk DNA. Whatever your proposed function, ask yourself this question. Can I explain why an onion needs about 5 times more non-coding DNA for this function than a human? A very succinct test if you think all those 3.5 billion letters are necessary and need to be perfectly ordered in the way that they are. Look, the suggestion here, we're talking about plausibility, is that this looks designed, and it looks more designed than it does evolved. Imagine walking into your local hospital, modern hospital let's say. Everything's well laid out, the corridors are well laid out. All the wards come off the side, there are elevators that will take a bed so that you can transport people on their beds up and down. It's already really well laid out. It looks designed, I grant that. Imagine you walk into a hospital, and when you get in there, there are some corridors that just don't have any rooms off them, anything off them. There's maybe a hole in the floor, a giant pit. There are some wards that are perfectly laid out, but the doorway is bricked up so that nobody can get into them. There are other wards you can get into them, but the beds are on the walls so that the patients would just fall out the beds. The equipment's broken and smashed up. There's another ward in there. You get halfway through the ward and suddenly the ward changes into a bar. And there's the beer taps and there's the bar there. But even the beer taps, the pipes don't fit through to the cellar because there isn't a cellar, and the pipes are all mangled up and attached to chairs. So it doesn't even function as a bar. Imagine you walked into a place like that. Even a drunken hospital designer would not design a hospital like that. I put it to you, is it plausible that the perfect, ultimate, omniscient designer would design a hospital like that, where 80 or 90% of the hospital is redundant, doesn't do anything? Some of those areas of the hospital have echoes of things that perform other functions elsewhere, or may have performed functions in the past, but they're just broken and twisted and distorted, and yet somehow still maintained, even though they didn't need to be because you built that hospital from scratch. Doesn't make any sense. I want to give you 2 examples of arguments, of the myriad ones, because these directly relate to the genome. The first is pseudogenes, genes that are broken, that no longer work. And I want to talk about olfactory pseudogenes because they're interesting genes. Genes that code for olfaction, for our sense of smell, have a kind of one-to-one purpose, which is unusual for genes A particular gene gives you one kind of olfactory receptor. So if you have 400 olfactory genes, you will have 400 different olfactory receptors. And the more receptors you have, the wider the variety of smells. Some animals rely more on their sense of smell, and they typically tend to have a lot more olfactory genes, or at least a lot more functional olfactory genes. Let me show you a chart here. In red, this is showing you different mammals, and in red it is showing you the number of functioning olfactory genes that God has given these creatures, let us say. But the blue bar is showing you that apparently God has also given them a whole slew of other olfactory receptors, but he's broken them so they don't work. Now, what sense does that make? Why would you include broken genes that don't work if you are designing? You can explain it with evolution. Let's have a look at this chart here. These are all the primates here in the different groups and their relationships to one another. In red, the little red bars are showing those groups which effectively about a third of their olfactory genes still function, and about 2/3 are pseudogenes. They are broken. You can tell that they are still an olfactory gene, but there is a mutation that has knocked them out so they don't create an olfactory receptor. In the black line, they have a higher percentage of functional ones. It's about 50% functional rather than about a third functional. The two arrows are showing the points where trichromacy evolved, where the lineages, rather than having just two opsins, two sensors for different frequencies of light, can sense light at 3 different frequencies, and so have trichromatic rather than dichromatic vision, and therefore can detect a lot of different variations in vision, presumably detecting a lot more and so relying less on their sense of smell. Ergo, there isn't the same selection pressure on smell and the same conservation of those olfactory genes. And look how that fits in, ladies and gentlemen. This is what we're being asked to entertain here. Is that you've asked God to make you a PC. God, make me a PC, please. You'd say please, because he's God, right? And he makes you a PC, and it's got all the latest shit in it. It's got solid state drives, hard drives, Blu-ray drives, just on the information storage side. But you're scratching your head. It's much bigger, this PC, than you would have imagined, right? It's not a little compact thing, because he's fitted a lot of other bits in it. He's fitted a 3.5-inch floppy drive in it, which you didn't want, but it doesn't matter because he smashed it with a hammer. Okay, it's still in there, but he smashed it with a hammer. He's also included a 5-inch floppy drive, which obviously you didn't want. People haven't used those for decades, but it's okay because he smashed it with a hammer. He's included some of those open reel magnetic tape drives. Nobody has used those for decades, but it's okay. He's smashed them with a hammer. He's included one of those punch card reader machines that computers had in the 1950s. Why would you want one of those in your modern PC? But guess what, folks? It's all right. He smashed it with a hammer. Now, does that look like a well-designed PC to you? It's got all these legacy things that have effectively no longer needed anymore, and they're all broken, but they've been included anyway. This does not plausibly look like what you would do if you were designing. Here is another example before I move on to the next question. Synonymous substitutions. It is often claimed, sounds reasonable on the face of it, that yes, evolution would obviously use the same genes, conserve certain genes and use them for the same function, but so would God. He wouldn't keep reinventing the wheel. He'd use the same genes. If it works well to do something, he'll use it again to do the same thing. Absolutely. Never disputed that. It makes absolute sense. But it's a little bit more complicated than that. When we talk about something being the same gene, what we mean is that when it's transcribed, it creates the same protein. So this is what you have. On your DNA, you have 4 nucleotides: adenine, cytosine, guanine, and thymine. And you go through this sort of RNA stage, but effectively, you've got 4 letters, and they make a 3-letter word called a codon. And each codon creates an amino acid. 4 letters in a 3-letter word, 4 to the power 3, that's 64 possible 3-letter words. There are 20 amino acids that make up our proteins. Okay, so here is a chart of the 4 letters of your DNA, and at the end of the transcription process, the amino acids that will result, the 20 amino acids, and also a stop sign. If you get that code, it stops transcribing. That's the end of that chain of amino acids. What you will notice is there is a lot of redundancy here. What you will know is that there are a lot of what are called synonymous spellings. You can change the spelling and you still get the same amino acid. Can you see where we're going with this now? So when we talk about the same genes in different animals, we don't mean it's exactly the same piece of code. What we mean is it produces the same amino acids, which produces the same protein chain. But just the same way as I could give you a sentence now in American English and International English, it would sound the same to you, it would invoke the same response from you, but I could write it down and it would have many different spelling differences between the American English and the International English. Okay, now that is what is going on here. This pattern fits in with evolution. If you look at closely related species and track them back and the relationships that we know they have, the evolutionary relationships we have, you can plot and you will see that the further back you go, the more of these synonymous substitutions that you find, and they tend to follow a pretty regular path that would be explained by evolution. You give me the plausible explanation of why God would use the same genes to perform the same functions in different species, but use different spellings each time, and use different spellings that fit in with what we understand to be the evolutionary relationships. The only plausible explanation I can find for God doing that would be if a God wanted to trick us, that it's a tricky trickster of a God that wants to make us think evolution took place when it didn't. Okay, so you decide for yourself with that. What is the most plausible explanation for those particular facts? Is it a designer that designed these things, or is this a process, an evolutionary process, a natural process that accounts for all this junk, accounts for all this crap, accounts for all this historical broken baggage that is within our genome, and also phenotypically expressed within our physiology? Question 6. How can atheists explain the force that powered the Big Bang of the universe? Another big question. And ironically, just like the last one, whereas I went through a phase of reading books on evolutionary biology, actually on this instance, ever since I was a teenager, I've been interested in relativity, quantum mechanics, and read sort of lay books intended for lay people on this subject and on the subject of cosmology and the Big Bang and all that kind of stuff. If I can make a recommendation, by the way, anybody who's interested, of all the authors that I've read, Brian Greene is the one that stands out for me, of hitting his books at the right level, a decent high level, plenty of information, but set out in a way and using examples and analogies that really hit home maybe better than anybody else. A lot is written on this particular question, too much for me to read out. You would be bored, even more bored than you are listening to me. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to read a couple of chunks out and give you a response, and then read you another chunk out and show you something, a little bit of video footage to show you on this. This is the first bit. The Big Bang suggests a start date for time, space and matter of around 14 billion years ago. So whatever existed prior to the Big Bang and caused its sudden inflation must necessarily lack those qualities. I think that is fundamental to the argument that is being made here, but I propose it is also fundamentally wrong. Our understanding of the Big Bang is the start of our spatial and temporal realm, of our dimensional existence, our universe, but that does not preclude an external set of temporalities, an external spatial realm in any way, shape or form. So that is a huge leap that is entirely unfounded. If I can give you an example of how that could work, I could create on my computer a simulated universe. And that universe would start at the point where I hit the start button or clicked on my mouse to start it. Okay. And if you existed within that universe, in your universe, that would be the start of time and space for your universe. That is a hard wall that you cannot go beyond. But it would be erroneous in the extreme to sit within that simulated universe and say, well, nothing can exist outside. That is the point that time started. And so anything that exists outside of this simulated universe must be atemporal and aspatial. I am proof that that claim would be wrong. We have no basis of making that claim with regard to our universe either. She then goes on to write, the cause of the Big Bang must be an uncaused first mover that is transcendent in time and immaterial, intentional and powerful. These are the characteristics of a supreme being and creator who started the expansion of the universe from nothing. Well, quite frankly, I am flattered. Scientists have suggested that it may be possible with sufficient technology that we could seed a universe, a physical universe such as our own, by creating an event that would then cause an inflation within its own set of dimensions of time and space. That we could effectively seed a universe, germinate a universe. If I was to do that, then what S J Thomason is saying is that I would be transcendent in time, immaterial, intentional and powerful, that I would be a supreme being and creator. I like to do a few pull-ups, ladies and gentlemen, but I never regarded myself as quite that powerful. This whole question is precursed on something which is actually not true or not demonstrably true. She ends it up with a sort of version of the Kalam cosmological argument. A, everything that begins to exist has a cause. B, the universe, time, space, matter began to exist. C, therefore the universe has a cause. D, the cause must transcend time and be intentional, powerful and immaterial. E, God. We've already shown how some of these claims are not necessarily true, but what I want to do is to play you a clip of Daniel Dennett. You may well be aware that William Lane Craig is really big on this. He founded what he calls the Kalam version of the cosmological argument, and this is Daniel Dennett responding, having just heard William Lane Craig present that. Have a listen to this. This is really, really interesting, sort of mind-melting stuff that he's talking about here. Have a listen.
What Professor Craig does brilliantly and with a wonderful enthusiasm is he takes our everyday intuitions, our gut feelings about what's plausible, what's counterintuitive, what couldn't possibly be true, and he cantilevers them out into territory where they've never been tested in cosmology, where whatever the truth is, it's mind-boggling. So we know in advance that whatever the truth is, it's going to be jaw-droppingly implausible and counterintuitive in one way or another. The simplest expression of this, I think, was due to the late Philip Morrison, who pointed out, perhaps we are alone in the universe. Perhaps there's no other planet in the whole universe that has intelligent life on it. Or perhaps that's not true. Both alternatives are mind-boggling. The hypothesis that we're alone is mind-boggling. The hypothesis that we're not alone is mind-boggling. So you can't use mind-bogglingness as your litmus test. The truth is going to be very hard to believe. And some of our home truths are going to have to be abandoned. We already know this from quantum physics. We already know this from Einstein.
That's a wonderful piece by Daniel Dennett because it is so bang on. I've shown that in a video before. Doubtless at some point I'll show it again. I've lost count of the number of times I've watched that privately. Because this is something that we really need to get to grips with here and not become blasé about this issue. And I say that to atheists as well. They're really, whatever, it's mind-boggling, whatever. Either the universe came from nothing, which is mind-boggling, or there has always in some way been something, which is equally mind-boggling. Either the universe arose as a process of naturalistic processes without any sentience or agency behind it to create all the things we see, which is mind-blowing, or there is some sentient agent, some intelligence that exists outside of our universe that willfully created our universe, which is at least equally as mind-blowing. There are no non-mind-blowing alternatives here, folks. And this is one example of something where, in terms of plausibility of giving an answer, I'm on slightly shaky grounds, and I've always been prepared to admit that. I've always regarded this as one of the atheists' weakest points, but not because our case is particularly weak, the non-religious case is particularly weak, but because nobody's case is particularly strong. Everybody's suggestion, every hypothesis, from the scientific ones, from the Christians, from the Hindus, from the animists, all of them sound crazy. All of them are counterintuitive. All of them are mind-blowing. And we need to be aware of that. Now you can trump things up which knock it back a level, right? Which knock it back a level. I know there will be some theists that watch this video that when they heard me talk about simulations and our universe being simulated by maybe life forms similar to ourselves, seeding our universe or simulating our universe, they'll have been wagging their finger and saying, yeah, but that hasn't explained anything. You've just knocked the explanation back a level, is what you've done. And yes, I have. You can do that. I wouldn't be doing that. It still doesn't ultimately explain anything. But that is the same trick that you play when you invoke God. It might sound like you're explaining something really difficult with something really simple, but you're not. You're explaining it with something else which begs more questions, frankly, than it answers. And in many ways, that is no form of an answer. Certainly not a form of an answer that satisfies. I don't know whether that's a plausible answer that I'm giving here. What I would suggest to you is that the answers that science gives have more of a ring of plausibility than the kind of answer that S J Thomason would give. Because S J Thomason's answer is of the form, I think I can demonstrate that humans exist, ergo Elvis Presley is still alive. Because that's what she's doing. She's going from a general case that she believes the evidence as is shows more likely that a God created the universe than not a God, ergo her God, with all the fantastical trimmings and bullshit that surrounds it, and Jesus and all this lot, right, is therefore the equivalent. You demonstrate a God and you demonstrate Christianity. I would suggest you've not gone a thousandth of the way of demonstrating the truth of Christianity, even if you managed to demonstrate the greater plausibility of an intelligence having created our universe. Okay, on to question 7. Question 7, how can atheists explain our desire for heavenly joy? So this is an odd one for me, and I think it's based upon a whole series of assumptions which are wrong. And I also think it stems very much from a religious perspective. I don't feel that desire. Why don't I feel that desire for heavenly joy? Certainly not in the way that it's been sold from Christianity. Christianity has never, in all the instantiations of heaven, has ever given me the rather more sordid version of heavenly joy that would appeal to me. Maybe the Muslims with their 72 virgins is a little bit closer, but not virgins, right? It's got to be sort of women that do all the dirty shit. Right, I'm sorry for bringing the video down, but that's closer to my understanding of heavenly joy. That is my desire. So does that exist, therefore, because that is something that I would desire? I propose that this is something that largely arises as a result of a religious upbringing, this desire, coupled with something else which I'll talk about in a minute. I don't have it because I don't have the religious upbringing. But I have been brought up in a society that is full of examples for children of superheroes with magical powers who can twist time and space and do all manner of incredible things, shoot ice lances or fireballs out of their hands. And some of those things I have desired. There's a particular one that I've fantasized about maybe for about 30 or 40 years now, involving playing professional sport and being able to rewind time a little bit, right? I have a real thirst for that. It's a bit embarrassing, right? Because it's just my little daydream fantasy, but I have a real desire for that. Does that mean that that's true, that that's fulfillable? Because otherwise, how could I have that desire? Of course, it doesn't mean that. I can understand C.S. Lewis, of course, back in the day, growing up in a society where people were a lot more religious than they are in the United Kingdom nowadays. Seeing that so many people had that desire and seeing that as some kind of ubiquity and therefore resonating, but as society has become less religious, it seems that desire has melted away. Can I suggest an alternative that is more plausible? Which is that effectively we don't evolve just specific desires, but we've evolved a tendency to be unsatisfied. And the reason that we've evolved a tendency to be unsatisfied is because if you're unsatisfied, you strive for more. And if you strive for more rather than sitting on your arse, you achieve more. And that has evolutionary benefits. And this idea of not being satisfied with what you have in the here and now is part of what drives the desire to accumulate more wealth, more possessions, more status, more everything. And some of those things maybe can't even be sated. They're unsatiable because that is the nature of the desire that you've evolved, which is a desire that is unsatisfiable because it always drives you on. And I think that is a more plausible explanation than this rather trite and specific example of this one desire that some Christians have for something which can't be sated on earth, ergo it must exist, when there are all these other desires we have for things which can't be sated on earth, which Christians would say yes, but they don't exist because they're contrary to our Christian beliefs. Question 8, the last question. What is the best explanation for the minimal facts surrounding Jesus' resurrection? Roman pagans, Jews and Christians in Jesus' time have all indicated that Jesus' tomb was found empty, and multiple sources have indicated that second-class women made that important discovery. In fact, Paul stated that 500 people witnessed Jesus over the next 40 days after he rose from the dead. Many biblical and extra-biblical sources have indicated that early Christians preaching illegally in support of Jesus for decades, braving beatings, stonings, crucifixions, beheadings, and being burned to death. And then it gives some of these minimal facts. And then the only way to explain all of the minimal facts is that Jesus resurrected. That is S J Thomason, what she regards as the most plausible explanation. There is a saying that extraordinary claims require extraordinary evidence. I would not categorize that as extraordinary evidence. I would regard it as an extraordinary claim. It is not alone in being an extraordinary claim. Almost every single religion makes extraordinary claims, many of which claim to be well attested to. Indeed, modern people who claim deistic status. Satya Sai Baba, who died in 2011, is one such individual who has thousands of people who testify to the miracles that he has performed and his deistic status. That is in the modern world. You have people who claim to have seen all manner of things. So at one time, many people, sailors, would testify that they had seen sea monsters. People claim nowadays, and have for some time, that they have had interactions with aliens in UFOs or have even been abducted by aliens. There are people, numerous people, that will give testimony that corroborates other people's testimony that they have seen UFOs, that they have seen alien life forms, and give descriptions that corroborate other descriptions. These are all extraordinary claims, and generally we require extraordinary evidence. I'm sure for all these other claims, S J Thomason requires extraordinary evidence for them and largely dismisses them because they do not have that kind of evidence. They have the kind of evidence that we know crops up for myriad claims that are spurious. Right. So what S J Thomason wants me to do is to make a one-time exception for her claim, to lower my standards to the standards that I would have for a much more mundane claim about Jesus. Jesus went to the shops on a Friday afternoon and picked up a loaf of bread. Okay, that would be a mundane claim, and I would accept mundane evidence. This is not a mundane claim. It might be to S J Thomason because she accepts a priori that Jesus is effectively God and so he can resurrect. It's a pretty mundane thing for him to do. But unless you accept that a priori, then it's not a mundane claim. It's an extraordinary claim, and it requires extraordinary evidence. I can give you a more plausible, rough outline sketch, I think. I'm not going to deny the existence of Jesus. I believe he probably existed, that he was an apocalyptic prophet, and that people believed that he was a Jewish Messiah. He was the person that was going to save the Jews from the sort of oppression of the Romans at the time. That's what he was going to do. And then he kind of buggered it up. He died very, very meekly, which is not what messiahs do, right? It's a pretty unmessianic thing. And as people have done throughout the ages, you see it on YouTube now. We've seen it recently with people who idolize certain individuals and then they really don't live up to it, twist themselves into a figurative pretzel to try and reimagine what that individual has done in light of the status and standing in which they held them. Imagine if you're basing your spiritual life on the idea that this guy is the Jewish Messiah, that he's the saviour of the Jews, and then you've just seen him meekly and pathetically die on a cross. You're going to reimagine that, aren't you? And it's reimagined in a way that he doesn't really die, that he's actually God, and that for some bizarre reason God goes through this process where by allowing us to kill him, he can therefore not have to punish us anymore for our inherently sinful nature that he gave us because of an offence that we'd committed in the Garden of Eden, which probably didn't even happen anyway, and Christians somehow resolve that it's an offence that didn't even happen because they don't believe in Adam and Eve anymore, but somehow that's the spiritual introduction of sin or something or other. It makes absolutely no sense. It's as if you smash my car up with a baseball bat, and I say to you, well, look, I'll let you off if you give me a punch on the nose. Right? That doesn't make any sense, does it? But effectively, that is the plausibility level, as far as I'm concerned, for the whole Jesus story, that he's dying for our sins. He's dying. What if we kill him, then God will let us off for being sinful? What, by committing another sin? By killing God? Even though he doesn't really die, that's not a death. If you've resurrected, you're not dead, are you? It makes absolutely no sense. There's only one context in which that story makes sense, and that's in the context of a fledgling religion that's struggling to deal with the material facts and trying to weave the best narrative that it can to deal with the events that it sees. And it's one of the weakest stories. Jesus' story is supposed to be the greatest story of all time. I think it's actually one of the most bizarre, weakest, nonsensical stories of all time. It makes absolutely no sense whatsoever. Okay, that's it. Those are the 8 questions. I can't tell you that I've given you perfectly plausible answers for them. What I would hope is that the answers that I've given are more plausible than the alternatives that S J Thomason can give. If they are, then I would suggest that you have to regard them in this context as plausible answers. Okay, that's it. If you like this video, give it a thumbs up. Leave a comment. Loads of interaction in the last one. It would be great to see that. Again, if you really enjoyed this channel and you're not subscribed, subscribe. If you really enjoy my material and you'd like to support its varied content, then I will leave you the links to Patreon, Subscribestar and PayPal recurring payments in the for footnotes. That's it for now. Thank you for watching, and bye.